picture this. You see a field with a beautiful sunrise of red and gold. You can hear birds singing. You can smell the wildflowers, and wind gently sways the tall browning grass. You hear a shout from behind you, and you turn to see two men dressed in sheepskin struggling violently. The younger of the two has an expression of terror on his face, and he tries to push the older man away. He shouts for help and looks around, but there is no one else in sight. The younger man, after ducking another blow, makes a run for it. The older chases after. The race isn't long. The older tackles the younger into the grass. We hear a scream, a thud, and then silence. Cain, now the first murderer in human history, stands. His brow is furrowed in envy, and an arrogant smile plays across his face. He drops the rock he was holding, wipes the blood on his hand on the grass, and creeps away from the field. And now we're in a different time, in a different place, and you stand before the Lord's temple that you have heard described in Scripture that Solomon built. You see the beautiful, tall, white stone building. You see the pillars of bronze on either side engraved to what look like trees, and you see the artfully engraved golden door. But you hear shouts behind you, and you turn around to see a mob forming. There's a man in the middle of this crowd, and by the look in his eyes, you can tell that this isn't the first time he's stared down a crowd. And by how he speaks, you can tell this isn't the first time he's shared this message. You cannot serve Baal on the high places and then come and worship the Lord here. What you are doing will not lead to your flourishing. Because you are rejecting God, he will reject you. This crowd has heard Zechariah for the last time. You see this group of respectable-looking religious folks and priests take stones out of their pockets. They must have carried them in. They have received permission from the crown for what they are about to do. And as the stones fly, the guilty murder the Lord's prophet in God's very house. Welcome to church this morning. Glad you're here. Now, you might be wondering, what does that have to do with our passage in Luke this morning? The Pharisees were probably wondering a similar thing. We're in Luke 11:37 through 54 today, and like Mark said, I got a curveball. Luke 11:37 through 54. Listen to Jesus' words in 49. For this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be held accountable for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be charged against this generation. Now, the reason I took us all on that imaginative exercise of Genesis 4 and 2 Chronicles 24 is I don't want us to miss the weight of what Jesus is saying here. The Pharisees and religious experts would have known exactly what Jesus is calling them. Evil. He's saying, you guys think you're the heroes of the story? No, you're the villains. You guys are Cain. You guys are the men that killed Zechariah in the temple. Now, as you can imagine, that friendly little statement didn't go over very well. They immediately have a meeting on how to kill the guy. I don't know about you, but I've never been to a party where all the other guests after I left planned on how to kill me. No one knows how to end a dinner party quite like Jesus. Could you imagine what the disciples were thinking? We know at least one of them was there. Luke might have got his eyewitness account from maybe Peter or Andrew. Could you imagine what Peter was feeling at that moment? These guys were really well-respected leaders and probably some of his heroes. He was probably in awe just to be in the room. And Jesus, to put it mildly, has no qualms about speaking his mind to these guys. I imagine Peter on the opposite side of the table kicking Jesus the whole time he's talking. Stop talking. And imagine the meeting when Peter and Jesus leave, what he would have said. Jesus, what were you thinking? We're going to blame them for Abel? We're going all the way back to Abel. Like, what did they do to deserve that? Why is Jesus so angry here? And as we come to this passage, it might be really easy for us to dismiss it. Jesus' words are so strange and bewildering and wild, it might be easy for us to just move along and go, Jesus got really mad here. And honestly, as we look at Jesus, this is not the type of Jesus that we're used to or the type that we might prefer. Jesus is really angry here. This is not Kumbaya Jesus holding a lamb with a flock of children following him. He's ticked. Doesn't Jesus actually have that warning about not calling people fools and getting angry? Why is Jesus so mad? And the answer is pride. He sees in the Pharisees pride. And we might be tempted to shrug off that sin and not think it's too big a deal, but Jesus recognizes in the pride of the Pharisees the same pride that guided Cain's hand to kill his brother. He sees in the pride of the religious leaders the same pride that caused the priest to kill Zechariah. Pride is a mindset, a self-centered way of living where we think that we matter most. And so, in light of that, we need to hear this passage today. We live in a very performative culture. Everyone's keeping up with the Joneses. There's this pressure to curate feeds on social media of our perfect lives. And on top of that, we're part of a church where we might be really tempted, or just church culture in general here in America, where we might be really tempted to do as the Pharisees do, to do good things, but with a mindset where we're thinking about ourselves, where we pray to be seen, where we give to see recognition, where we read Scripture just so we can post it on Instagram. Pride is behind this mindset. And just like Mark talked about last week, in Jesus' warnings, maybe they're the clearest example of his grace. Maybe in Jesus' hard words here, Jesus is trying to get after something in our heart. God is deeply bothered by the pride that is in our lives that will lead only to suffering and our own hurt. So buckle up. Let's learn from Jesus and listen to what he has to say to us this morning. Starting in verse 37. As he spoke, a Pharisee invited Jesus to have a meal with him. So he went in and took his place at the table. The Pharisee was astonished when he saw that Jesus did not first wash his hands before the meal. Your first reaction to this might be gross. Jesus, haven't you heard of washing your hands before? What did Mary teach you? I might have to talk to her about that. I know my mom would be upset. But there's a lot more going on here than that. We need to understand a little bit more about how the Pharisees understood themselves and about the ritual washing that they practiced at this time. So stay with me. Maybe a helpful way to understand the Pharisees and these Torah experts is almost like understanding them as pastors and seminary professors. It would have kind of mapped on in a similar way to what these guys' roles were in their time. The Pharisees were a little more boots on the ground, people-oriented, in people's lives, walking side by side with them. And these Torah experts were a little more like seminary professors. They were a little more study-oriented and experts in their fields and their specific texts. But all of these guys were highly regarded by the Jews of their time. Under Roman occupation, these guys were Torah guardians. They were preserving a way of life that was threatened, and as other Jews were walking away, they were trying to distinguish themselves and preserve following the Torah. One thing that they were preserving, and one ritual that comes from the Torah, is this idea of ritual washing. So get out of your head the mindset that we might have of our categories of sanitary and dirty. These guys were thinking in categories of what is pure and what is impure. what is holy and what is ordinary or profane, what is of God and related to the life that he gives, and what is related to death. To try to make this more concrete, let's imagine that you were part of a Jewish family around Jesus' day. Let's say that the ox died of natural causes, old age maybe, and you guys, because you don't want to just leave the meat to waste, decide to throw a barbecue. You and yours in the Jewish religious world would be considered unclean. Listen to what Leviticus 17:15 prescribes. Any person who eats an animal that has died of natural causes, or an animal torn by beast, whether a native citizen or resident foreigner, must first wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean till evening. Then he will be clean. Do you see the category going on in these people's minds? And the Pharisees actually added more on top of what is prescribed in the Torah. They, to distinguish themselves from the non-practicing Jews and Gentiles, would add ritual washing before every meal. They would have a bowl of water and sprinkle it on their fingers as a way to distinguish themselves from others. As humans, we're really good at taking our religion, the thing that's supposed to humble us and get us to love God and neighbor, and turn it into something that makes us feel superior to others. Jesus sees the Pharisees sprinkling water on their hands. That's not cleaning anything. And skips the line, sits down, grabs a chunk of pita, and starts eating. The Pharisees' shocked faces make Jesus decide that he has something he wants to say to them. But before we get into Jesus' words, I'm going to need a volunteer to come up on stage. I was a youth pastor, and object lessons die hard. So, yeah, I need a brave volunteer to come up. Don't think so? You know, it's nice my family's here. I can always... Logan, you can come on up? Thanks, bro. Round of applause. Yeah, you can. All right, man, you can stand right here. Okay, so I have a choice I'd like you to make in front of all of us, okay, Logan? So I have water bottle number 1. This is an unopened bottle of water I bought from King Soopers a couple days ago. Now I have water bottle number 2. This is water I collected from a gutter close to my house. Okay, so Logan, I want you have this choice here. I want you to pick which water bottle that you would like to drink from. Water bottle number A, good job. Round of applause. You made the right decision. All right, you can put that down. Actually, I forgot something. Hold, please. How about now?
That's kind of dumb.
Okay, you can be seated. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, what Logan said, that's kind of dumb. I thought that when I came up with this idea and was like, I'm going to keep it. Because I think when Jesus sees the Pharisee sprinkling his hands with water, that's exactly what's running through his mind. That's kind of dumb. When he sees them doing that, he sees this. Cleaning a water bottle that's dirty on the outside. And then... I'm joking. I'm not going to do that. That's gross. I'm not going to become ritually impure, all right? What Jesus is seeing here, is that these Pharisees care more about themselves than God. That is what is on their mind as they do this. Now we're ready for Jesus' words, starting in verse 39. But the Lord said to him, Now you Pharisees, clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You fools! Didn't the one who made the outside make the inside as well? But give from your heart to those in need, and then everything will be clean for you. The words that Jesus says here leads me to my main point this morning. If you're taking notes, write this down. Jesus is essentially saying, woe to the performers. How sad is the life of those who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat their relationship to God like an act on the stage. Woe to the performers. How sad is the life of those who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat the relationship to God like an act on a stage. Now, as we're hearing this morning, it might be really easy for us to just laugh off the Pharisees and appreciate the humor of Jesus' words here. But they're for us as well this morning. Jesus is giving us a way to escape from performance that we feel. As Christians in this community, we don't have to worry about having the nicest car or the nicest house or the coolest vacations. We don't have to have on our minds the thoughts of how people perceive us. Our likes and follows don't determine who we are as people. Your job and your performance isn't who you are at your core. We don't have to have it all together as a community to follow Jesus together. Jesus wants to set us free from that. He's going to go on to share 3 woes with the Pharisees, and they're all reflections on this main idea. Let's start with verse 42. But woe to you, Pharisees. Actually, let's pause. What does woe mean here? I looked it up in the thesaurus, and the 2 options I saw were alack and alas. It sounds very Shakespeare, and I didn't find it very helpful. The word in Greek is actually not so much a noun as it is an expression of sorrow. Something someone would say if they heard bad news. What Jesus is saying here is really important to think about. Jesus is angry, to be sure, but he's deeply sad. I love the NLT's translation. What sorrow awaits you, Pharisees? He knows that the life they're leading is going to lead to a bad place. If Jesus' Beatitudes, how blessed is the one who, is a statement of Jesus saying this is what the good life looks like, then Jesus' woes here is Jesus saying this is what the bad life looks like. Now we're ready for verse 42. Jesus says, but woe to you, Pharisees. You give 1/10 of your mint, rue, and every herb, yet you neglect justice and love for God. You should have done these things without neglecting the others. Abraham Lincoln once said, character is like a tree, and reputation is its shadow. The shadow is what we think it is, and the tree is a real thing. The Pharisees are messing about with shadows when their tree is puny. They care about form when they should care about content. They're majoring in the minors. They've made this beautiful building for themselves, but they've neglected its foundation. Jesus is so sorry for these guys. When the test comes, they will fall. Do you value these small things over a relationship to God? I remember in college, I went to a more charismatic college ministry, and worship was highly praised. We would worship for hours at a time. And I remember going up to the very front of the stage so that everyone would see me and raising my hands as the worship songs are playing. And in my mind, I was thinking about how people were perceiving me, especially if that cute girl in 3rd row just thinks what a godly man I am. But that's the danger. We can be so close to the throne and end up just worshiping ourselves. Are you worshiping yourself today in the guise of worshiping God? Woe to the performers. How sad is the life of those who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat their relationship to God like an act on a stage. Woe to you. Verse 43. Woe to you, Pharisees. You love the best seats in the synagogues and elaborate greetings in the marketplaces. Jesus is saying, man, you guys love praise? Oof, that sucks. I'm so sorry to hear that. Do you love praise? Is that something you value? Jesus seems to say here that to just love praise is a bad thing to value. He sees that it's ultimately fruitless. As we pursue praise and status and self-worth and all the things we do to make us feel better about ourselves, there will always be someone else who is better than you, who has more money than you, who has more follows. It is a fruitless endeavor. I love this quote from David Foster Wallace. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally grieve you. Woe to the performers who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat the relationship to God like an act on a stage. Verse 44. Woe to you! You are like unmarked graves, and people walk over them without realizing it. Jesus here is tapping into the tradition of the prophets, and especially Ezekiel, who used this image of whitewashed tombs that look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside there's only death. But Jesus adds his own twist to this. Remember, this is a culture that cares deeply about ritual purity. An unmarked grave would be deeply offensive to the Pharisees and religious leaders. A priest who's serving at the temple could walk over the path and become impure without realizing it, and then go back to serve in the temple. Jesus knows how to push their buttons. This reminds me, I think what Jesus is talking about here is unconfessed sin and the havoc it can play in people's lives and in people's ministries. He reminds me of a story one of my friends who was a pastor back at the camp I worked at, I had met, and he had told this to me about he met a very famous Christian apologetist who had a national platform. And my buddy Chris was working at this conference at the time, and he was ushering the speakers to the stage. And we'll call this apologist Mr. Unmarked Grave. And Chris needed to find him because it was Mr. Unmarked Grave's turn to speak. So he went to his room where he was waiting in the wings, and he knocks on the door, and Chris just hears uncontrollable weeping. And he opens the door, and there's no one else in sight, but Mr. Grave is on his knees weeping uncontrollably. And I just couldn't imagine how miserable that man must have been, especially as a scandal and stories of abuse came out after his death. He must have been so lonely. It must have been such a horrible life to live with no one else for him to talk to. Jesus here is saying that we can be free of that burden. Listen to what David says in Psalm 32. He says this about the freedom of confessing. When I refused to confess my sin, when my whole body wasted away, when I groaned in pain all day long, for day and night you tormented me. You tried to destroy me in the intense heat of summer. Then I confessed my sin. I no longer covered up my wrongdoings. I said, I will confess my rebellious acts to the Lord, and then you forgave my sins. Jesus is offering us forgiveness of a false way of living. Woe to the performers who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat the relationship to God like an act to be performed on the stage. Okay, at this point, Jesus has said 3 woes. Could you imagine the awkward pause? The Pharisees are red-faced with furrowed brows. Peter is red-faced for a different reason. And Jesus calmly looks around the room, decides he's still hungry, and maybe selects some goat cheese and an olive to add to his pita bread as he continues his meal. And one of the Torah professors gets an idea. He's going to try to save the meal. He goes, verse 45, one of the experts in religious law answered him, Teacher, this is a term of respect, Rabbi. This guy is trying to be tactful with Jesus here. When you say these things, you insult us too. I don't know exactly what this guy had in mind when he said this to Jesus, but I expect he was hoping to use the clout of his circle to get Jesus to back down from what he said. Oh, I'm so sorry I offended the seminary professors as well. I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. Pharisees. People say the Bible isn't funny. The Bible's funny. Jesus finishes chewing, swallows, and then gives 3 more woes that are way worse and longer. Jesus replied, "Woe to you, experts in religious law as well. Thank you for reminding me. You load people down with burdens difficult to bear, yet you yourselves refuse to touch the burdens with even one of your fingers. Woe to you. You build the tombs of the prophets whom your ancestors killed. So you testify that you approve of the deeds of your ancestors because you killed the prophets and you build their tombs. For this reason also the wisdom of God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill and persecute, so that this generation may be held accountable for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, it will be charged against this generation. Woe to you, experts in religious law. You have taken away the key to knowledge. You did not go in yourselves, and you hindered those who were going in." Notice that Jesus switches his talk to the personal behaviors of the Pharisees to the external mindset of the Torah professors. As we begin to take this false standard as our own, we begin to judge others by that same false standard. We end up pushing away the people who most need Jesus when we do that. Woe to the performers. How sad is the life of those who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat their relationship to God like an act to be performed on a stage. So, as we wrestle through what this means for us in our life, let's look at how these guys respond to Jesus. I imagine he reads the room, sees that he's not welcome anymore, and Jesus says, can I just get a to-go box? I'm going to leave. Verse 53, when Jesus went out from there, the experts in the law and the Pharisees began to oppose him bitterly and to ask him many hostile questions about many things, plotting against him to catch him in something he might say. These men will go on to commit the worst atrocity ever committed in human history, the crucifixion of Jesus. They couldn't accept that there was something wrong with them, so it must have been with the speaker. And so as we reflect on what this means, I think the text is saying to look at the Pharisees. Are we going to respond like these guys to Jesus' wisdom here? So let's not blame shift. I want to take a moment just to pray with Jesus. I have a few questions for us. Let's just take some time to close our eyes and bow our heads and reflect on what this means for us. Question 1. Is there anywhere in my life where I care more about how I'm perceived by others than my actual relationship to Jesus? Question 1. Is there anywhere where I care more about my relationship and perception by others than my actual relationship to Jesus? Question 2. Have I been attempting to use God or religion instead of just being with him? Question 2. Have I been using God or religion instead of just being with him? Question 3. Do I have unconfessed sin that I need to confess to someone today? Question 3. Do I have unconfessed sin that I need to confess to someone today? Thank you, guys. You can open your eyes. There was only one will-less person who ever lived. There was only one perfect man, and who, at every point in his life, these woes that Jesus shares here never applied to. And that is Jesus himself. And so as we end today, if the message you hear from me is just try harder, then I failed. Our only hope that we've ever had is in the gospel and in the grace of Jesus Christ being found in him. So as we close today and as we prepare our hearts for communion, let's listen to Jesus' words one more time. Woe to the performers. How sad is the life of those who care more about the outside than the inside, who treat the relationship to God like an act on a stage, but how blessed are those who are in Christ Jesus, who draw near to him and let him humble their pride. Thanks. I'm going to pray.